Nobody warned Dara Osei that Riverview General had a pecking order. Nobody had to. She figured it out in the first 20 minutes. It was the way charge nurse Pauline Brandt looked at her when she handed over the orientation packet. Not hostile, exactly, but the kind of flat, measuring look you give someone when you've already decided they won't last. It was the way Dr. Callum Rhodes spoke to her the first time their paths crossed in the hallway, not even turning his head fully, just enough to catch her in his peripheral vision and say, "You're the new float?" Like she was a piece of furniture that had been delivered to the wrong room. Dara said yes. She didn't explain anything else. She'd learned a long time ago that explaining yourself too early was a mistake. In Kandahar, the medics who talked the most in the first week were usually the ones who fell apart when things went sideways. The quiet ones, the ones who watched and listened and cataloged, they were the ones who were still standing when the dust settled. So Dara watched and listened. She noticed that the ER at Riverview ran on a hierarchy that had nothing to do with ability. Rhodes was at the top because he'd trained at Toronto General and never let anyone forget it. Below him were the senior nurses. Brandt, a woman named Carver, and a heavyset man called Theo who had worked the floor for 11 years and treated that tenure like a military rank. Below them were the residents, who were so exhausted and anxious to prove themselves that they'd agree with almost anything Rhodes said. And then, at the very bottom, were the float nurses, the temporaries, the ones who were handed the worst assignments and the least information and were expected to be grateful for the work. Dara was a float nurse. She didn't mind. She'd held lower positions. She'd held a pressure dressing over a femoral bleed in a vehicle that was still taking fire. She'd intubated a man in the dark, with her hands shaking so badly. She thought she might drop the laryngoscope. She'd called a death on a kid who couldn't have been more than 19. His whole life just stopped in a forward operating base in a country that most of the people at Riverview General couldn't have found on a map. Compared to that, Pauline Brandt's flat stare was manageable. The first 2 weeks went by quietly. Dara did her work. She was thorough and fast, and she didn't make mistakes, which seemed to confuse Brandt more than anything else. Once, Dara overheard Brandt telling Carver in the break room that the new float was adequate. The word was delivered the way someone might describe a car that started reliably but had no air conditioning. Adequate. Dara poured herself a coffee and said nothing. She got along well with the patients. That had always come naturally to her. The ability to sit with someone who was scared or in pain and make them feel like the room had gotten a little quieter, a little safer. She'd done it in triage tents when men came in from firefights with that particular hollow look in their eyes, the one that meant their body was present, but their mind was somewhere back on the road where the IED went off. She knew how to talk to people who were frightened. She knew how to be a steady thing in an unsteady moment. Rhodes didn't notice, or if he did, he didn't consider it a skill worth acknowledging. As far as he was concerned, bedside manner was something you listed on a resume, but rarely needed to actually deploy. What mattered in his ER was speed, decisiveness, and deference to his judgment. Dara was 2 for 3, which was apparently insufficient. The 4th week, he called her out in front of the entire trauma bay. It was over something small, a medication draw that Dara had documented correctly but hadn't verbally reported to Carver before administering, because Carver had been on the phone with a patient's family, and Dara hadn't wanted to interrupt. The patient was fine, the medication was appropriate, the documentation was complete, but Rhodes seized on the procedural gap the way he seized, on everything that gave him an opportunity to remind the room who was in charge. "This is exactly the problem with floats," he said, loudly, not looking at Dara but making sure everyone else was. "No accountability, no commitment to the team. You're not in whatever clinic you came from before. This is a trauma department. We have protocols." Dara looked at him steadily. "I understand. It won't happen again." "I'd hope not." He walked away. Theo watched her from across the room with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not sympathetic, but not pleased either, like a man watching someone get a speeding ticket and feeling quietly grateful it wasn't him. Carver, to her credit, came over afterward and said quietly, "He does that to everyone." It wasn't much, but it was something. Dara nodded. "I've met men like him before?" She meant it as a neutral observation. It wasn't a complaint. She'd met men like Rhodes in uniform too, men who confused authority with competence, who needed everyone in the room to know they were in charge, because their own certainty about that fact was more fragile than they'd ever admit. They weren't always bad at their jobs. Rhodes was actually a capable physician when something in him clicked into emergency mode. He just didn't think anyone else was. The month turned over. Dara settled into the rhythms of the department. She learned which supply closet had the things you actually needed when you were moving fast. She learned that the ultrasound in Bay 3 drifted left and you had to compensate. She learned that the third-year resident named Priya was the one to go to if you needed a fast consult, because Priya had read everything and forgot nothing and didn't have Rhodes's need to be the only expert in the room. She didn't talk about herself. When people asked where she'd worked before, she said, "Up north," and left it there. When someone at a shift handover asked if she'd done military nursing, she said she'd done some work with the Canadian Armed Forces, which was technically accurate in the way that saying you'd been near water was technically accurate about having spent 3 tours forward deployed with Joint Task Force 2's medical support element. Nobody pushed. Float nurses didn't usually have interesting backstories. People assumed. Then the call came in. It was a Tuesday afternoon in November. Gray and wet outside the way southern Ontario gets in November, the kind of weather that makes everything feel slightly underwater. Dara was restocking a crash cart when the radio crackled with a mass casualty alert. Industrial accident at a construction site 12 minutes out, multiple critical. At least 2 confirmed traumatic injuries, possible crush. Riverview wasn't a level 1 trauma center, but they were the closest facility by a significant margin, and on a Tuesday afternoon, they had 2 trauma bays open and a full ER team. The hospital went into its mass casualty protocol. Rhodes appeared from wherever he'd been and took position at the center of the room with the particular energy of a man who had been waiting for exactly this kind of moment. "Trauma Bay 1 and 2, he said. "I need my A-team only. Residents to triage support." He looked briefly at the assembled staff and then, deliberately, did not include Dara in the eye contact. "Float nurses, standby positions." "Standby." She went to standby. The first ambulance came in with a man named Kitteridge, 50s, hard hat still on when they brought him through the doors, a gash across his shoulder that looked worse than it was. Brant and Theo had him. He was shaken but stable. The second came in 4 minutes later. The paramedics were moving fast, faster than they usually did, and the one at the head of the gurney, a young woman whose face had gone the specific gray of someone running on adrenaline alone, was calling vitals before she'd even cleared the ambulance bay doors. Male 31, construction foreman, fell approximately 4 meters onto rebar. Entry wound left thoracic, suspected pneumothorax, BP dropping, GCS-7 on scene. We had a pulse, but... And then Dara was already moving, because she'd heard the particular cadence of that sentence, and her body knew what it meant before her mind finished processing it. She was across the room before anyone told her to move. The patient's name was Fournier. She got that from the paramedic's transfer sheet. He was 31 years old, and he had a piece of rebar through the left side of his chest, and his oxygen saturation was falling. The way something falls when the clock is already running. Rhodes was 3 steps behind her. He arrived at the gurney, took one look at the wound, and his jaw set in the way it did when he was recalibrating. Okay, we'll stabilize the foreign object, get imaging, and... He's got a tension pneumo developing, Dara said, not loudly, just as a fact. Rhodes looked at her. I didn't ask for your assessment. His trachea is deviating, she said. Left side. Listen to his breath sounds. Priya, who had followed them both into the bay, grabbed a stethoscope and pressed it to Fournier's chest. Her eyes changed. She's right, Priya said quietly. Left side is absent. Rhodes took the stethoscope, listened. His expression shifted through something complicated. Confirmation, resistance. And then the thing that overrode both of them, when he was being the doctor he actually was, instead of the performance of himself he usually maintained, he registered the information and acted on it. But he was slow, just a half-second slow, because this particular injury pattern, rebar penetrating left thoracic, tension pneumothorax developing in real time, patient with a GCS of 7 who was going to become a 0 in about 90 seconds if nobody made a decision. This was not something you saw in the Riverview ER very often. Dara had seen it in Kandahar. She had seen something close to it on a base in Wainwright during a training exercise, gone wrong. She had seen it in the dark and under fire and in the back of moving vehicles, and she had seen what happened when the half-second became a full second, and the full second became 2. She was already prepping the needle. What are you doing? Rhodes demanded. Needle decompression. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. He's got less than a minute. You don't have authorization to. Dr. Rhodes. Her voice was still calm, the same voice she used in the field, the voice that wasn't asking permission, wasn't arguing, was simply stating what was going to happen next because the alternative was a body bag. He's going to arrest. We are out of time. Priya said very quietly. Do it. There was a moment, maybe 2 seconds, which felt very long, in which the entire bay was completely still. Brant, who had appeared at the edge of the bay, was watching with an expression that, for the first time since Dara had arrived, contained no assessment of her at all. Just watching. Gura did the decompression. The sound of air escaping is distinctive, unmistakable, and Fournier's oxygen saturation, which had been in for freefall, stabilized. Not perfectly, not immediately, but it stopped dropping, and his blood pressure on the monitor ticked back up, and Priya exhaled audibly. Rhodes said nothing for a moment. Then, get thoracic surgery on the phone. We need a chest tube and an OR. He said it to the room, not to anyone specific, and he walked to the other side of the bay and stood with his back partly turned. And Dara understood that this was the closest he was going to come to acknowledging what had just happened. She didn't need acknowledgement. She needed Fournier to live. They worked for the next 2 hours. The rebar came out in the OR. The chest tube drained what needed to drain. Fournier's GCS came back up. By the time he was in recovery, he was squeezing a nurse's hand when asked, which was the most specific kind of good news in that particular situation. Dara was charting at a workstation near the end of her shift when Brant came and stood next to her. Not in front of her, next to her. "Where did you train?" Brant asked. "CFB Petawawa," Dara said, "and a few other places." Brant was quiet for a moment. "My brother did 2 tours. He came home and said the medics who went forward were something else." "They're good people," Dara said. "Most of them." "Are you one of them?" Dara looked up from her chart. "I just needed work closer to home." "Aren't." Brant nodded slowly. She didn't push. She walked away, and Dara noticed that the particular flatness in her expression had softened into something that wasn't quite warmth, but was no longer the other thing either. The next morning, Dara arrived for her shift to find the department slightly altered in a way she couldn't immediately name. Then she realized people were making eye contact with her when she walked past, not in a loaded way, just acknowledging she was there. Theo nodded at her from the nursing station. Priya gave her a small, genuine smile. Carver moved to make room for her at the coffee maker without being asked. It wasn't a transformation. It wasn't applause. People didn't stop what they were doing to line the hallway. The ER kept moving the way an ER always keeps moving, because there are always more patients, always another chart, always another family in a waiting room who doesn't understand yet what the doctor is about to tell them. But the room felt different, and Dara had been in enough different rooms to know that the difference was real. Rhodes didn't speak to her for 2 days. On the 3rd day, he came to the workstation where she was reviewing a patient file and stood beside her. He looked at the screen. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Your documentation is thorough." From Callum Rhodes, who once told a resident that competence was the floor and not the ceiling, this was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Dara said, "Thank you." He walked away. She went back to the file. What happened 3 weeks later, nobody at Riverview was prepared for. It was a Friday morning, quiet by ER standards, when 3 vehicles arrived in the ambulance bay in close succession. Not ambulances, SUVs, government plates nondescript, and then a military medical transport pulling in behind them. Dara was in triage. She heard the commotion at the bay doors and turned. The man they brought in was a JTF-2 operator. She knew it before anyone said anything, knew it the way you know a certain kind of posture and a certain kind of economy of movement, the way you know the specific silence that surrounds men who have been trained to be invisible. He'd been injured in a training incident that nobody in the hallway was going to get details about. His team had brought him to the nearest hospital with a trauma bay and a surgeon. That was here. That was Riverview. And the man walking beside the gurney, who had held the medic role on that team, who had done what he could in the vehicle on the way over, a compact, serious man in his late 30s, with the particular eyes of someone who had spent years operating in places most people only heard about in classified briefings, stopped at the entrance to the trauma bay and looked across the room and went very still. His name was Sergeant Reeve. Dara had last seen him at a forward operating base in Kandahar in 2019, when he had told her, with blood on his hands and a radio in the other one, that she had just saved his team's radio men and that she should consider a career outside the military because she was wasting herself where she was. They looked at each other across the trauma bay of a civilian hospital in Ontario on a gray Friday in November. Reeve took in her scrubs, her badge, the small, competent stillness of her standing in a room where people were moving fast around her. And then he did something she hadn't expected. He stood up straight, and he nodded, a precise, deliberate nod that in his world meant exactly what it looked like: recognition, and something that sat above respect because it had been earned in a specific way, in a specific place. "Corporal Osei," he said quietly. "Master Corporal, actually," she said, "by the end." Something moved across his face, almost a smile. Of course it was. Rhodes had come into the bay and was standing 3 feet away, watching this exchange with an expression Dara had never seen on him before. Not confusion exactly, but the look of a man recalibrating something he thought he'd already figured out. Reeve turned to him and said, "Your nurse is the best trauma medic I've ever worked with in the field. Whatever you're paying her, it's not enough." Then he turned back to the gurney, back to his operator, back to the work that always had to come first. The bay moved. Dara moved with it. She did what needed doing. She was calm and she was fast, and she did not think about what had just happened in the room until much later, when the shift was over and the lights in the parking lot were the only lights left, and she was walking to her car through the November cold. She thought about it then, just for a moment. She'd come to Riverview because she needed a job, and it was close to her mother's house in Hamilton, and she had been tired in the specific way that people get tired after years of watching things that cannot be unwatched. She hadn't come to prove anything. She hadn't come to be recognized. She'd come because there was always another patient, always another shift, always another room where knowing what to do made the difference between what happened and what could have happened. That was enough. That had always been enough. She got in her car and drove home through the dark. The following Monday, she walked into the department and Pauline Brandt was at the nursing station, and when Dara approached, Brandt moved slightly to make room for her. At the counter, a small, deliberate gesture, the kind that didn't require explanation. "Fournier's family called," Brandt said. "He's going home Wednesday." "That's good," Dara said. "His wife wants to send something. Flowers, I think." "Tell her he doesn't need to." Brandt paused. "I'll tell her he already did what needed doing." Dara looked at her. For a moment, something passed between them that wasn't quite friendship, but was maybe its foundation. Two women who had spent a long time in rooms where the work was serious and the hours were long, and the quietest people were not always the ones with the least to say. Then the radio crackled. A new patient, ETA 4 minutes. They both turned toward the bay doors, and Dara Osei went back to work. I keep thinking about the moment Dara didn't say anything when Rhodes called her just a float, not because she had nothing to say, but because she'd already learned something most of us spend years trying to figure out, that the people who need to announce their worth are usually the ones least certain of it. There's a kind of cause and effect in this story that isn't dramatic, but it's real. Rhodes built a room around his own authority and kept it that way by making sure no one else had enough space to be fully themselves. And it worked for a while. It always works for a while. But rooms like that have a ceiling, and when something bigger than the ceiling arrives, a man with a rebar through his chest and 90 seconds on the clock, the architecture collapses. Not with a speech, not with a confrontation, just with someone quietly doing what they came to do. What I take from Dara's story isn't the moment Reeve nodded at her across the trauma bay, as much as that image stays with me. What I take is what came before it. Every shift she showed up without asking for credit. Every time she documented correctly and stayed calm and kept the knowledge of what she'd seen and done somewhere private, not because she was ashamed of it, but because she understood that your history doesn't need an audience to be real. The integrity of that, the way she chose to do things right, even when no one was watching, and no one was rewarding her for it. That's what made the moment with Reeve mean something. You can't fake that recognition. It lands because it was earned somewhere no one could see. I think about the kind of mental discipline it takes to walk into a room that has already decided what you are and simply refuse to take on that identity. Not with defiance, not with resentment, just with clarity. Dara had seen enough to know that a person's assumptions about you are not data about you. She'd been in situations where the margin for error was a human life, and the only thing that mattered was whether you actually knew what to do. That knowledge, the kind you've tested under real conditions, doesn't need validation from someone like Rhodes. It exists independently of his opinion. And then there's the part of this that I think is easiest to overlook. She kept going. After Kandahar, after whatever she carried home from those tours, after however many nights that kind of work costs you. She kept showing up, kept learning the hospital, kept noting which ultrasound drifted left, kept making space for the scared patients who needed someone to sit with them in the hard moments. That's not resilience as a concept. That's resilience as a daily practice, without applause, without a finish line. I don't think stories like Dara's are really about the salute at the end. I think they're about all the ordinary Tuesdays before it. The ones where she made the right call in the break room, at the medication cart, in a trauma bay with no time left. That's where the real story is. The rest is just the world finally catching up.